This week on Indie by Design's Gaming the Podcast, we are talking about remakes, remasters, and reimaginings. What are the meaningful differences between them? Are publishers using the correct terminology, or at least a terminology that makes most sense for the player? And what value do they hold today, and why are they now so common? You can get involved in the conversation by visiting us on Twitter. We are at Indie by Design. And also don't forget to check out our website, indiebydesign.net, to take a look at all the video game books that we write and publish. So on with it, and let's talk about remakes.
Video game remakes and remasters, and there's a distinction between the two that we will get to shortly, can often be used as a force for good. They can be a thing that enhances or at least builds on the original source material, at least in terms of video games. But sometimes they can also feel, if they're done badly, they can feel like just a cash grab and something that's rushed out the door to fill the gap in between franchise installments, for example. So, John, what's your kind of your overall take on remakes, remasters? Where do you think where have you seen them be used as a force for good versus just being used as something to fill the time?
A force for good? No, I don't think I've ever...
Ambitious.
Yeah, never thought of that as a label for them, a force for good. Yeah, so, I mean, they take a lot of different forms, don't they? And in recent years, they've had not a resurgence really, because they weren't really that common, but they've sort of pushed themselves to the very forefront of gaming, I suppose. Like some of the biggest releases now can be put into the remake camp. So I guess for me, I mean, the most obvious ones, Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, but particularly Resident Evil 2 and 3, I think are interesting as remakes. Demon Souls, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Catherine Full Body as well. They're all very...
So that's where like the actual original source material is being used to build kind of a new thing, right? Or it's being built upon. It's not just being reskinned and made shiny.
Yeah, so video game remakes tend to go in those different camps, don't they? They tend to be like the remaster that often people call a remake, but I think that's actually a fallacy. That's not a remake. That's the equivalent of a film being released in 4K or whatever. That's like the Blu-ray release, and it was previously only on DVD or VHS or whatever. I wouldn't. And some games call themselves remakes, but they're not remakes. That's just a visual sort of paint job. Yeah.
So The Last of Us remastered on PS4, it was originally a PS3 game. On PS4, that was definitely a remaster. And then there's now talk about there being a new version of the original Last of Us. Maybe that's just, again, a straight remaster of just it's now on PS5 and looks even prettier than it did before. But it would be far more interesting if it was a remake. But
yeah, and I think that those sort of games, those sort of remasters, that form of remake have a benefit in that people that couldn't play those games, like maybe they don't have a PS3 or whatever, and that can now play the game again in largely its original form, but with some extra bells and whistles on to make it more palatable, because video games go out of fashion or go out of tastes very quickly. Less so now, but very quickly because of the sort of innate technological nature of it. But yeah, the interesting ones are the full-on, are like the reimaginings, like Final Fantasy VII Remake. It's taking the original source material, but reimagining it. And I think actually the remake label in that game, again, because different companies, different game developers, different publishers use remake in different ways, actually the remake label for Final Fantasy VII Remake, I think actually potentially does it a disservice, because you can think, okay, they're remaking that original game, but they're not. They're not making that game again at all. They're making those characters and kind of that same plot, although it's changed quite a bit, and those locations, they're reusing those, but the way that they interact, the way that you interact with them, everything, the goals of the game, the pacing, everything is, even the genre to an extent is completely different. So I think in that, reimagining is actually more fitting a title for that, because it's almost like taking the original story and reimagining it as a whole new entity.
And also, do you think that ties into, because Final Fantasy VII is now what, a 24-year-old game? The original
95 it came out. So
okay, even
older
I thought
than
it was
that.
97. So even
26.
further than. So is that part of why there's been a?
No, actually, right. It's 97. PS5 came out in 95.
So yeah, it's 24 odd years.
Yeah.
So is that part of the reason why there is more? Because it's not a resurgence, is it? You're right. It's not a resurgence, but more of just they're becoming more popular. Because there's now more history to draw on and more very pertinent history, very like history of some of the pinnacles of video games from the 1990s, and they can be. There's something to actually do with them. It's not just here's a PS3 upgrade of a PS2 game. It's like we can actually do something with this. We actually now have the time. This has established itself as an item of cultural significance in the video game landscape. So let's do something that really pays it the kind of respect that it's due, rather than just a fresh lick of paint. And so as we kind of go, the further we get along the line and the longer video games are around, there's more back catalogue to do that with, so that's perhaps part of why we see these things happening, because there is significant distance between, there are quite literally people that weren't born who are now playing video games who weren't born when the original Final Fantasy VII came out. And this, something you said the other day when we were talking about this, is I think a very relevant point as well, about the technological barriers to just being able to go back and play that original game. Because it's not as simple as, well, if you've got a DVD player, or even a VHS player, which is still, it's not unheard of, but going to buy a PS1 and then finding the PS1 version of that game that works on that machine and a memory card, and there's a lot of stuff that you need. There's a lot of hardware obstacles to get over.
Yeah, there definitely can be. I mean, on Final Fantasy VII's one, Final Fantasy VII is quite easy to find because it is on PlayStation Store, it's on everything. But there are examples of that for sure. Like Metal Gear Solid is very difficult to play the original game without a PS1. You can download it on GOG now, and I did download it on GOG and played all the way through it. But it's a terrible port. Like getting the control scheme up and working on the controller is a real pain. Like takes a long time. You have to use like an external program, external from the game, to map your controls to it, and you have to like memorize what buttons are what, it's like what actions are what outside of the game, which is a real pain, and definitely a real pain for. Don't want to do anyone a disservice, but the average user, unless you're au fait with a lot of that stuff, it's going to be a real pain. And also the graphics are worse on the GOG version. Yeah. The graphics are worse than the PS1 version, which is just insane.
Yeah. And it's, so realistically, I guess, or not realistically, but the people that's most likely to appeal to, who are most likely to jump through those hoops to do that, are people that already played the original and remember it fondly and have an affinity for it and want to re-experience it, rather than somebody who didn't get to play it first time round. To ask them to jump through those hoops is like, it's going to impact their experience immediately to have to do all that before they can even play this game they've heard so much about. So in those instances, a remake can, just as a quality of life thing, can do a great deal. And currently that is rumoured, the Metal Gear Solid remake is a thing that may be happening. And I think I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, actually, I've been playing the Ghosts and Goblins remake on Switch, which that's a very well done remake. It takes the original source material, but it does, as you mentioned, different video game fashions come and go, and it does it simultaneously kind of sands off some of the harsh edges that came from the original game being an arcade game. Like that, it was never meant to be, or it wasn't designed to be, a game that you sat and kind of seamlessly progressed all the way through. It was meant to be a thing where there were spikes of difficulty to make you put more money in the arcade machine. It's quite that was factored into the design, and so that some of that has been smoothed out. Whilst it still retains it being incredibly difficult, there is just some stuff that it means you're not going to be throwing the controller across the room in anger that you might have done once upon a time. Yeah,
so I think there's a couple of things there, because there's the hardware, the nature of video games and its hardware-centric reality does play into both of those things. As you say, it can alter the game design so that it actually makes less sense in comparison to its intended game design document on a new piece of hardware than it did on the original piece of hardware, like an arcade machine. It's a very clear example of that. But also because video game hardware changes all the time, not only on the console side, but also on the PC sides. Like in the last sort of decade and a half, it's been fine. But, there wasn't that long ago where you had to use special emulation software and stuff to run older games, like, the Monkey Island games and whatever. So, trying to play an original Metal Gear Solid for someone who wasn't around to play it in the PS1 era is an issue to play it in that original form. I mean, cynically, you can say that feels like a bug, but it's actually by design, because video game companies, hardware manufacturers make more money if you have to keep buying remakes of games all the time because the hardware is now defunct. So you can sell the same game to someone 5 times if you keep replacing the hardware.
And that does happen, right? There are versions or examples of poorly done, or things that just feel like they're rushed out the door, or things that feel like they've just been inserted in between 2 franchise entries because we need to refill the coffers and we need some money to fund development for something else.
The Silent Hill remakes. The Silent Hill trilogy was a joke. The Metal Gear Solid one's not great either. You do get those bad ones, and it does become a problem with the hardware. So it's kind of by necessity almost that you need remakes in order for people to play those games. But they can be great. You can release almost the same game again and have a clever little twist on it. And for both newcomers and people who experience the original game, it's great. Like, again, Catherine Full Body is that. It's largely the same game. If it's the first time you've ever played it, I don't think you'd feel like, the full body bits of the game. Like, it wouldn't feel like, I can see immediately what bits are tacked on here, because it's not tacked on.
It's like a director's cut, right? Like, it's like these are the bits. It's not just, here's 20 minutes tacked on the end. It's, here's this thing woven through, or the Zack Snyder cut of Justice League or whatever. It's like, it's done in that way, and it enhances, hopefully if it's done well, it enhances the whole thing. Yeah. And like you say, it gives those people that have played it reason to go back and do so again.
Yeah, and I think the best thing about Catherine Full Body is the writing quality. So they've weaved this new character in, but without actually changing much of the original character's dialogue. Well, Vincent's, yes, but the other 2 Catherines, their dialogue doesn't really change that much. And yet they managed to weave this character really cleverly into the writing in a way that manages to impact all characters and your perspective of the entire situation. And that can't have been an easy writing job. That's not easy to just go through something that existed and is a complete experience, and then to add a whole new character in there, but keep the actions of the original story involving the other characters pretty much the same. Like, that's not an easy piece of work.
Does that approach kind of the Catherine 1.5 style? That it's not like it's a remake, but there's added content. It's not the base thing is the same, and there has been progression, and there is more going on than there was before narratively. So is that, where does that even sit?
Yeah, because I don't know if I would describe that as more. Yeah, I don't know if I'd describe that as more content, because it's not like, and now here's the DLC that we released as now part of a definitive edition or whatever. It's not. It changes the actual fundamental of the story. The actual experience is markedly different for that change. Yeah. So it's not like just a kind of volume-based expansion. It's an experiential change. And I can't really think of any other examples like that, really. Like, there are other games that have had like characters added and stuff, like a bunch of RPGs and stuff have characters added, but they are just kind of team party members. They don't change the plot, really.
And there's definitely those ones where it is like, here's the DLC, here's like the Game of the Year edition, which has got the added DLC, and in something like, The Witcher 3, like here's a couple of whole other areas you can go to that were DLC, but that are now kind of have been properly sort of subsumed into the world, and they're still gated to an extent. You still need to get to a particular point in the story, but once you have, you can experience that as part of an integrated whole, rather than I've got to the end of the main quest line, I need to go and do this. Yeah. So that's not that kind of, that isn't let's remake the original thing and add new stuff. That's just let's bring it all under one roof. And that was quite I don't know if has that kind of gone out of fashion, because that was quite a popular, that almost to the point of the kind of the typical like refrain would be, well, I'll buy this, I'll buy the Game of the Year edition of this in a year's time with all the added DLC, and probably for cheaper than the base game costs right now. But I don't know if that seems to have become less of a thing.
I think that's still quite common. I can't remember how common it was last year, but maybe that's like that ebbs and flows depending on sort of where we're at in the console life cycle, probably, or where we're at in terms of anniversaries, or just by chance, this thing is now at the right age for this. I mean, I don't tend to play that many of those sorts of releases. I guess
like the all-encompassing, all the DLC one style.
I guess, I don't know. I guess because we play so many games anyway, probably already played the game already. So they don't tend to be that attractive, and I often am looking for the next game rather than going back to ones that I've already played, although obviously I do still do that. Obviously Metal Gear Solid I've already mentioned. But yeah, I don't know. It's not that I have no respect for those games. It's just they're not remakes they are just products, right? They're just a new SKU of an existing thing, just to make it kind of simple for the end user and also to make the publisher more money. But it's those ones we're seeing now that are modernizations of an original concept. And it doesn't have to be like a full-on changing of the experience like in Final Fantasy VII or Resident Evil 2. It can just be kind of taking the core and adding modern elements to it. Like Crash Team Racing is a pretty good remake. It takes a lot of the original mechanics. It's crushingly difficult as well, just like the original was, just compared to like Mario Kart and other sort of kart games like the Sonic kart games. Like it's much more involved than that. There's a lot of mechanics going on with boosting and drifting and sliding around corners that make it quite difficult. And if you're online playing against other people who are good at that, like just good luck. Like the rubber banding and stuff makes up for that in no way whatsoever. Yeah. But that's got like a kind of mini battle pass system. You don't need to spend any money, but that's like kind of how you unlock stuff. It's got obviously all the online suite of stuff. It's got kart and character customization. And it might sound like small things, but it is just like quality of life extras that make the game feel a lot bigger and a lot more substantial. And it feels like you're getting rewarded. You're getting those like dopamine hits, literally, probably is what's happening. It does add a sort of sense of grandeur and
it adds a persistence, I think. Like it adds something outside of just here's 8 races to race in succession. They're literally just on a list. Like it fleshes it out. It adds more to do and more to engage with and more to do when you're not racing. It's like, oh, there's all this other stuff for me to have a look at and spend time in this world. Which, for people that like, as with anything, when you like something, you search out more of it. And so that's a nice way of, and it's reflective of more modern gaming. It's reflective, people come to expect that kind of thing. It's like, well, of course I can customize my car, or of course I can unlock new things that then I need to go back and experience the game with these new things unlocked. So, and that, do you think that, because, so as you were talking then, the notion of there being those online elements in particular, like that, surely just the whole online experience has accelerated or has kind of motivated or even facilitated the existence of things like remakes, because they can be, just in terms of a digital distribution format, they can, like, you can remake a game and it doesn't need thousands or millions, depending on the property, of physical products that you need to manufacture and transport and store and distribute. It doesn't need that anymore. It can just be, here's a remake and we're going to put it on one of the various digital platforms, and it's done, right? And we can update it going forward, and we can, squash any bugs that accidentally come up and that kind of stuff. So like just in terms of a form and function thing, like the fact that you can it's now so easy to buy digital games, that just feeds into the whole thing and makes possible remakes that perhaps weren't possible before, because it just wasn't financially viable.
Yeah, well, I suppose the Oddworld games are like that, aren't they? New and Tasty and Soulstorm. I mean, they have physical variations. I don't know if Soulstorms are out yet, but physical versions are coming. Yeah, definitely. Like the more. Yeah, I mean, so I suppose the more channels to market you've got, the more risk you can take, I suppose, on different kinds of games. I don't know how much more likely that's going to make full-on remakes of the sort of Soulstorm, and New and Hasty. But I guess Resident Evil was that, wasn't it? Resident Evil 2 and 3 were online only. They weren't boxed.
I mean, they didn't. I don't think these things happen because they can be distributed digitally. But I think if there's a conversation to be had, and I'm sure there is at a publisher, about, okay, so if we're going to do this thing, what are the commitments? Well, it's this much time, it's this much, person power, it's this much budget, and also at the end of it, we then need to figure out all of these logistics. It's like, well, you can remove all of that, and that just, I mean, it has its own, putting something on a digital platform has its own costs associated with it, and you have to go through certification and all of the rest of it, but you don't have to, you don't have to literally ship something from one place to another, which then makes like the physical variations of them can then be kind of these collector's editions that kind of are then celebrated, rather than just here's a disc in a box, which is not very exciting.
Yeah, I still think that's down to an individual game case-by-case basis. I don't know how big the Resident Evil 2 and 3 teams were, or the Resident Evil 1, but the Final Fantasy VII Remake, that was a full-on, hundreds of people are making that. That's not a... And now we'll just quickly release this thing on PSN Store next month. It's like, this is like 6-year development or whatever, and however long the next one, however long the next one's going to take. So that's a giant, like that's as expensive as pretty much any game.
So then, what's this thing coming out?
Any game.
Just and to put you on the spot, I'm asking you this very specifically because it's Final Fantasy VII. What's coming out in the summer? What's the kind of, because it sounds a bit like a remake of. That's too strong, but a remake of episode 1, effectively, of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is...
so that's an updated version for the PS5. So if you've already got the PS4 version, you get the PS5 upgraded pack, whatever that is, visual pack, for free. And you also get, you don't. You have to buy the extra content, I think. So the extra content has like Yuffie in it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I remember you.
So you can, you get all of that. But I believe, and you have picked me on the spot, I believe that's a separate element. So I don't think that's woven into the original story that you've played. I believe the Yuffie stuff is separate, I think. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Okay. All right.
But I think...
I shouldn't have asked. But it's an interest. I saw the name and it's like, okay, so now there's this whole other thing coming out before episode 2, and I know that's not how they're terming it, but part 2, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I'll play through the whole thing again when it comes out, when the PS5 version comes out. I'll play through the whole thing again. I was actually going to start it after Christmas, but I've waited to have that as a whole new thing. I mean, there are a bunch of games as well, like as you were saying at the start, like because we're now I think because gamers are older, there's more nostalgia to draw from. There's more history to draw from, whether you've played PS1 era games or SNES era games or whatever before. There is a lot of scope now to revisit some games of the past that are either, outright classics like Metal Gear Solid, or they're kind of just slightly a level or two removed from that. They might be a cult classic, or they might be like underappreciated gems in their time. That
The Medieval remake, I think, was that the PlayStation Medieval remake was that. I mean, that was never like a blockbuster hit, but it was a game that had a cult following, and that it's that. I think that's one of those titles, a bit like something like Lost Vikings or something. It's like if I were to hear the name, I'd be like, oh yeah, I'd love to see how that has been reinterpreted or remade or remastered, depending on exactly how it is that they're doing it. So yeah, there's definitely different tiers of properties. That maybe that quite simply translates into how they get what the treatment of them is, because ultimately what can we expect from this, really? Yeah,
because they're going to have a certain level of sort of fame and influence and love. Otherwise, why would you go back and take an old property and remake it now for a new audience, rather than just creating a new franchise from scratch that you can like market test and hit all the boxes and stuff? Because I'm thinking like things like, I'd love to see Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver back as like a full-on remake.
Of Kain I'd love to see as well. That was amazing.
Yeah, or like Parasite Eve, the Silent Hill games as well. When I wasn't really that into those when they came out. I was more like Resident Evil side of the fence. But I'd love to play a remake of Silent Hill now, and just see what that slower, and that's that slower vibe. Less interested in the characters, but certainly the setting of Silent Hill is always like such a cool setting that I think you could do a lot with now, with a full-on, Resident Evil 2 style, like degree of thought and recreation and like love for the core material.
Yeah, but I wondered, like, is that a challenge? That's one of those games. Silent Hill famously, was incredibly foggy. The draw distance was very, very short for a technical limitation reason, and it was interpreted well, and it was kind of factored into the artistic vision of the game and made to be a feature rather than a constraint, or rather, it didn't suffer because of it. It was better because of it. But is that one of those instances where that would be a difficult thing to recreate in terms of tastes and fashion now, to have something that is incredibly, well, you basically just can't see where you're going at any given time. And, is that like gonna, would they have to chuck in something like, Eagle Vision or Batman Vision, or, whatever, that kind of thing to make it palatable? Yeah,
I don't know how they do it. I guess what you'd have to do potentially, if the decision was, okay, no, we can't just have fog everywhere, people in the reviews are going to complain that the draw distance is bad. I guess what you'd have to do is you'd have to just take the core sensation of feeling like you're suffocating and it's claustrophobic and you don't have your senses are very limited. You just have to take that core essence and somehow translate that in a way that would work for modern audiences. So it probably wouldn't be that you can't see 5 feet in front of your face, but there would have to be something where you were limiting players' ability to see in this case,
and that perhaps falls into like the reimagining category rather than a remake, because then you're using that source material and interpreting it in a different way. Yeah, you're trying
to recreate the emotions and the sensations, as opposed to necessarily the exact game mechanics. Although you would have to lean on a certain amount of game mechanics as well. But I don't think that would be too hard. Like it's just the same game mechanics as a lot of other things. Limited resources, not having to know, not knowing where you're going all the time, having backtracking a lot to solve X, Y, and Z. I mean, that stuff's still very popular. Like the latest Resident Evil, not even Resident Evil 2 and 3, but like Resident Evil 7 and what it looks like with Village as well. Like that stuff's still really popular. So I don't think that would be an issue. Yeah, the issue would be intelligently recreating those emotions, and I think that's the key thing, really, because I suppose to bring it full circle back to Final Fantasy VII, like even though I was saying like the game is barely the same genre as the original, I think what it does do is it does recapture, does like remake, I suppose, those emotions, some of them that you had from playing the original. Like you still get that emotional connection between you and some of the characters. It's still exciting in the same moments. It's still like the essence of sort of injustice and fear and all of this stuff that you're sort of imbuing onto these characters that you're seeing are still the emotions that you still get. And some of the emotions in the combat, even though the combat's very different, there are some emotional elements that remain the same, and that sort of like tension and the risk and reward elements are still the same. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's what makes that so special, even though it's very different, is that the emotional core of the game is pretty similar. Yeah.
And that I think, I mean, it's not an emotional thing on this example, but with the things like the LucasArts remasters of things like Day of the Tentacle and Full Throttle and Grim Fandango, there is an element of recreating something to. It's kind of a trick, like a trick of the mind. It's recreating something to be the way that you remember it when you think back on it. Because when I think back on those kinds of games, the Monkey Island remakes are the same. Or again, they're not really remakes, remasters. The Monkey Island games are the same because when I think back on those, I don't remember them being like super blocky and only 16 colors and whatever it was. But when you play them, you're like, oh, wow, this really is dated. In my mind, for example, the original Monkey Island game had speech in it because that's just how it was written so well that when I read it, it kind of jumped off the screen. And then to go back and to play it and you realise that actually, it's all silent on the originals. But then the way that they're put together is it has the updated game laid kind of effectively over the top of the original, and you can switch between the two whenever you want. So that gives you a real kind of, it serves as a nostalgia hit for those people that were there originally. It also serves as almost like a history lesson for those that didn't play the originals and can kind of see how we used to play video games back in the day. But that has that, so it elicits an emotional reaction, but the game itself isn't necessarily like doing a different thing to hit the same beats. It's just literally it's recreating that emotion by giving you the original and giving you something that is a bit more palatable to play 30 years later, or more or less. So to sum up, to wrap up, to define a remake, then we've kind of established is something that is taking the original source material and artistically changing it or reinterpreting it or doing something with it that is beyond just what it looks like. Effectively, it's not just that remastering process. It's something that fundamentally changes and adds to the original. And a remaster is, I mean, what is it? As simple to say that a remaster is just what it looks like?
A remaster is just a re-release, essentially. Yeah, with some graphical up. But then there are middle grounds here, aren't there? So it's still not perfect because Demon Souls isn't a remake, I wouldn't say, even though it's called Demon Souls Remake. It's more on the remaster side. Yes, there are differences that change some of the elements in it in a meaningful way and in a good way. But would that be in the same category as Final Fantasy VII Remake? Like, no, it's not.
There's some, and there's a couple of very interesting things they did with that I read about how Bluepoint, they changed like some of the weapon animations, for example, but they still took up as many frames. So like the timing, it feels the same, but it looks different. So like it's been remastered effectively, but it hasn't just been made to look pretty and now it runs in 4K, 60 frames a second, whatever. It's like there is actual additional artistic interpretation that's gone on here beyond just it being flung at them and them being told to make this look pretty on PS5. Like it's far beyond that. So yeah, that's a whole other category in and of itself.
Yeah. So neat summing up. I don't know.
There isn't one.
And it's because different companies use the term in different ways, and also different players have different expectations, or different acceptance levels of what they consider a remake and what they call a remaster. And both of them, both remasters and remakes, while I think there's more value in the full-on remake, there is definitely value in the remaster as well. Certainly if it's if it's hardware limitations, you can't play the original game. Even if you not that you can't play it, it's that, oh my god, I have to go into the attic and get out the PS3 and set it all up. It's a hassle. It's much nicer just to be able to say, okay, I'm going to download it on PC or PS5 or whatever you're using. So it's those are just like, well, quality of life all around. They add the bells and whistles, but they also make it easier to access. Whereas a remake is, in my mind, a remake is something that actually changes pretty fundamentally what you're remaking the original idea, really. It's like a tearing down and then and literally a remaking, a rebuilding upwards and changing things as you go. So we've mentioned quite a few examples on both sides of that line. I mean, undoubtedly, we've probably missed some very famous examples that have done things very well, and hopefully people can let us know those, because I'm sure there'll be some. Black Mesa is one that I think you mentioned a while back. If there was one, as of right now, if there's one remake that I would recommend, it is the Ghosts and Goblins on Switch. I think if you were put off originally because it was too hard, or if you've heard that that's an incredibly difficult franchise to get into, that's a very good place to start. And if you can get past level 2, then you're doing better than I am. Thank you for listening. What are your thoughts on the value and the state of remakes, remasters and reimaginings? Let us know on Twitter. We are at Indie by Design. And if you enjoyed the show and you would like us to reach more people, then please do take a moment to leave us a nice review on iTunes, as it really, really, really does help us spread the word. Otherwise, all the best, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.